The knock came like a prayer against his cabin door, 3 soft taps that shattered 20 years of silence. Harlan Vane had built his solitude like a fortress, but when he opened that door to find a shivering wisp of a girl asking, "Can I be your daughter for tonight?" his carefully constructed walls crumbled like dust. The words hit him harder than any bullet ever could, because they spoke to the hollow space where his own child's laughter once lived. In that moment, beneath the endless New Mexico sky, 2 broken souls found each other in the darkness. Subscribe to witness how even the most guarded hearts can learn to love again. The giant cowboy's hands trembled as he stepped aside, knowing his life would never be the same. The wind carried more than snow across the desolate plains of New Mexico that December night. It carried the sound of small knuckles against weathered wood, a sound so foreign to Harlan Vane's ears that he thought it might be a dream. For 20 years, no soul had dared approach his cabin on the ridge above Cactus Bluff, where the sagebrush grew twisted and the coyotes sang their lonely songs to an indifferent moon. He had chosen this isolation deliberately, building his sanctuary far from the whispers and sideways glances of townspeople who knew his story but never spoke it aloud. The knock came again, softer this time, like a child's hesitant plea, and something deep in his chest, something he thought had died long ago, stirred with painful recognition. His massive frame unfolded from the chair where he'd been nursing his 3rd whiskey of the evening, each step toward the door feeling like a march toward judgment. The floorboards groaned under his weight as he approached the heavy oak barrier that had protected him from the world's intrusions for 2 decades. His hand hesitated on the iron latch, calloused fingers trembling with an emotion he couldn't name, while outside the wind howled like all the ghosts he'd tried to forget. When he finally pulled the door open, the sight that greeted him nearly brought him to his knees. A slip of a girl, no more than 8 years old, with eyes like winter stars and clothes that hung on her small frame like borrowed sorrow. Snow clung to her dark hair like tiny prayers, and her lips were blue with cold, but it was the way she looked up at him, without fear, without judgment, only with a desperate hope that cut through his defenses like a blade through paper. She stood there shivering in the doorway, this impossible child who had somehow found her way to his forgotten corner of the world, and in her presence he felt the first crack in the ice that had formed around his heart. "Mister," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind's mournful song, "I'm lost, and I'm cold, and I don't have nowhere else to go." The words tumbled from her lips like scattered pearls, each one landing with the weight of absolute truth in the space between them. Harlan found himself staring down at this fragile creature, his mind struggling to process the reality of her presence, while his body remained frozen in the doorway, like a statue carved from granite and regret. She clutched a small bundle to her chest, perhaps all her worldly possessions wrapped in a torn piece of calico, and the sight of it sent a sharp pain through his ribs, reminding him of another child, another time, another life that felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. The snow continued to fall around them, creating a curtain of white that seemed to separate this moment from the rest of the world, as if God himself had decided to give them this pocket of time outside the normal flow of existence. "The caravan got robbed," she continued, her small voice gaining strength as she spoke, "and they took everything and left us scattered like seeds in the wind." Her words painted pictures in his mind, images of violence and abandonment that he knew all too well from his own past, when the world had shown him its cruelest face and left him bleeding in the dust. He could see it all. The overturned wagons, the screaming horses, the desperate scramble of families torn apart by men who took what they wanted and left destruction in their wake. This child had somehow survived that chaos, had somehow found the strength to walk through the snow and darkness to his door, and the courage it must have taken made his throat tighten with an emotion he hadn't felt in years. She looked up at him with those impossibly large eyes, and he saw in them a reflection of his own lost soul, a mirror that showed him not the monster he believed himself to be, but simply a man who had forgotten how to hope. The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither dared to cross, while the wind continued its relentless assault on the cabin's walls and the snow piled higher around the girl's small feet. Harlan felt the weight of decision pressing down on his shoulders like the hand of fate itself, knowing that whatever choice he made in this moment would echo through both their lives like ripples in a still pond. He had spent 20 years building walls to keep the world out, 20 years convincing himself that solitude was safer than connection, that isolation was preferable to the risk of loss that came with caring about another human being. But standing there in the doorway, looking down at this shivering child who had somehow found her way to him through the storm, he felt those walls beginning to crumble like ancient stone. The part of him that had once been a father, the part he thought had died with his own child, stirred to life with a pain so sharp it nearly doubled him over. Then she spoke the words that would haunt him forever, the words that would change everything. "Can I be your daughter for tonight?" The question hung in the air between them like a prayer, simple and devastating in its honesty, and Harlan felt something inside his chest crack open like an egg. She wasn't asking for charity or pity. She was asking for something far more precious and dangerous. She was asking for love, even if only for one night, even if only as a pretense against the cold and loneliness that threatened to swallow them both. The words hit him with the force of a physical blow, because they spoke to the deepest wound in his soul, the place where his own daughter's memory lived like a constant ache. He stood there speechless, this giant of a man reduced to trembling silence by the simple request of a lost child, while the snow continued to fall and the night pressed in around them like a living thing. Without a word, Harlan stepped aside and gestured for the child to enter, his massive frame casting long shadows across the cabin's interior as the firelight danced against the log walls. The warmth hit her like a gentle embrace, and he watched as she stepped carefully across the threshold, her small feet leaving wet prints on the rough wooden floor, while her eyes took in the sparse furnishings of his self-imposed exile. The cabin was simple but solid. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth cold and dark, while a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs occupied the center of the single room. And in the corner stood a narrow bed covered with wool blankets that had seen better days. She moved like a ghost through his space, this unexpected visitor who had shattered his solitude with her presence, and he found himself seeing his home through her eyes. The emptiness of it, the way it reflected the hollowness he had cultivated in his own soul. The door closed behind them with a soft thud that seemed to seal them both inside this moment, away from the storm and the world beyond. "What's your name, child?" he asked, his voice rusty from disuse, the words feeling strange and foreign on his tongue after so many years of speaking only to himself and the wind. She turned to face him, still clutching her small bundle, and in the dim light he could see that her clothes were indeed too large for her tiny frame, hand-me-downs that spoke of poverty and loss, of a life lived on the margins of society where children learned early that the world was not a kind place. Her dark hair hung in damp tangles around her face, and her skin had the pale, translucent quality of someone who had known hunger as an intimate companion. But her eyes, those remarkable eyes, held a strength that seemed far too old for her years. She studied his face with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read the intentions of adults, searching for signs of danger or kindness, and he realized with a start that she was evaluating him just as thoroughly as he was evaluating her. "Josie Bell," she whispered, the name falling from her lips like a secret shared in the darkness, and something about the way she said it, with a mixture of pride and sorrow, told him that it was perhaps the only thing she truly owned in this world. He nodded slowly, filing the name away in his memory like a precious stone, and found himself wondering about the story behind it, about the parents who had given her that name and where they might be now in this vast and unforgiving landscape. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable but contemplative, as if they were both taking the measure of this strange new reality they found themselves in, this unexpected convergence of two lost souls in a cabin on the edge of nowhere. She set her bundle down carefully on the floor, and he noticed how her small hands shook. Whether from cold or fear or exhaustion, he couldn't tell, but the sight of it stirred something protective in his chest that he thought had died long ago. "I'm Harlan," he said finally, the introduction feeling both necessary and inadequate, as if his name could somehow explain the man he had become or the reasons why he lived alone on this desolate ridge. She nodded solemnly, as if she understood that names were important things, markers of identity, in a world that seemed determined to strip away everything that made a person unique and valuable. He moved toward the fireplace with the deliberate care of a man who had learned to be gentle despite his size, kneeling before the cold hearth and beginning the ritual of building a fire that would chase away the chill that had settled into both the cabin and their bones. His hands worked automatically, stacking kindling and logs with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this task countless times, but his mind was elsewhere, grappling with the impossibility of this moment and the way this child's presence had already begun to change the very air in his sanctuary. The first flames caught and began to dance, casting warm light across the cabin's interior and creating shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own against the log walls. Josie moved closer to the growing fire, her small hands extended toward the warmth, like a flower turning toward the sun, and Harlan found himself watching her with an intensity that surprised him, noting the way the firelight played across her features and brought color back to her pale cheeks. She was beautiful in the way that all children are beautiful, with an innocence that the world had not yet managed to completely destroy, despite whatever hardships had brought her to his door on this snowy night. The fire crackled and popped, filling the silence with its ancient song, and he realized that for the first time in 20 years, his cabin felt like something more than just a place to hide from the world. It felt almost like a home. "Are you hungry?" he asked, the question emerging from some deep well of paternal instinct that he thought had dried up long ago, and when she nodded eagerly, he felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. He moved to the small pantry where he kept his meager supplies, pulling out a can of beans and some hardtack, simple fare that had sustained him through countless lonely meals, but which now seemed inadequate for this precious guest who had honored him with her trust. As he prepared the food, heating the beans in a cast-iron pot over the fire and breaking the hardtack into manageable pieces, he found himself humming softly under his breath. A lullaby his own mother had sung to him decades ago, the melody emerging from his memory like water from a hidden spring. Josie watched him work with those remarkable eyes, and he could feel her presence like a warm light in the darkness of his soul, melting ice that had formed around his heart and threatening to flood him with emotions he had spent 20 years learning to suppress. The beans bubbled in the cast-iron pot, while Harlan carved slices from a loaf of bread that had gone stale 3 days prior, each cut deliberate and careful, as if the simple act of feeding this child could somehow repair the fractures in his own foundation. Josie sat cross-legged on the rough wooden floor, her small fingers tracing patterns in the dust that had settled between the planks, creating invisible maps of places she might never see, her voice soft as moth wings when she spoke of the caravan and how the men had come like thunder in the night. The firelight painted shadows across her face that reminded him of another child, another time, when laughter had filled these same walls and tiny feet had run across these same boards, leaving echoes that still haunted him in the darkest hours before dawn. He set the bowl before her with hands that trembled slightly, watching as she cupped it between her palms like a precious thing, the steam rising between them like incense in a church he had stopped believing in long ago. "My papa used to make beans," she whispered, blowing gently across the surface, "but his were never this good, and he never made them taste like they were made with love." The words struck him like a physical blow, settling somewhere deep in his chest where he had thought all feeling had died, and he found himself remembering how his own daughter had praised his cooking, how she had declared his biscuits better than her mother's, how she had wrapped her arms around his leg and called him the best papa in all of Texas. Josie ate slowly, savoring each spoonful as if it might be her last, her eyes never leaving his face, studying him with the intensity of someone trying to memorize every detail for a future that remained uncertain. "You're sad?" she said finally, setting down her spoon with the careful precision of a child who had learned not to waste anything. "I can see it in your eyes, the same sadness my mama had when she looked at Papa's empty chair." Harlan felt his throat constrict, the familiar weight of grief pressing down on his shoulders like a yoke he could never remove, and he turned away to stoke the fire, using the motion to hide the tears that threatened to betray the careful walls he had built around his heart. The wind outside had grown fiercer, rattling the windows and sending drafts through the gaps in the walls, but inside the cabin felt warmer than it had in years, filled with the presence of this small soul who had somehow found her way to his door. Josie finished her meal and set the bowl aside, then moved closer to where he sat, her movements tentative but determined, like a wild creature approaching a campfire, drawn by warmth but wary of the flames. "Can you tell me about her?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, and somehow he knew she meant his daughter, knew that this child possessed the strange wisdom that sometimes comes to those who have lost everything and learned to see the world with different eyes. He looked down at her upturned face, at the trust shining in her dark eyes, and felt something crack open inside his chest, a dam that had held back 20 years of carefully contained sorrow. "Her name was Sarah," he said, the words coming out rough and broken, like stones tumbling down a mountainside, "and she had hair the color of wheat in summer and a laugh that could make the angels weep with joy." Josie nodded solemnly, as if she understood the weight of such memories, as if she knew that speaking the names of the dead was both the most painful and most necessary thing a person could do. And she reached out with one small hand to touch his weathered fingers, her touch light as a butterfly's wing, but somehow strong enough to anchor him to this moment, to this unexpected grace. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks up the chimney like prayers ascending to heaven, and Harlan felt the walls around his heart beginning to crumble, brick by careful brick, under the gentle assault of this child's presence, this small miracle who had asked to be his daughter for one night and somehow made him remember what it felt like to be human again. Morning crept through the frost-covered windows like a thief, stealing the intimate darkness that had wrapped around them through the long night, and Harlan woke to find Josie curled against his side like a kitten seeking warmth, her small body rising and falling with the rhythm of dreams he hoped were kinder than the reality she had fled. He had not slept so peacefully in 20 years, had not felt the deep rest that comes only when the soul finds temporary refuge from its wandering, and he lay still for long moments, afraid that any movement might shatter this fragile peace that had settled over them like snow, covering the harsh edges of the world. The child stirred against him, her fingers clutching at his shirt, as if even in sleep she feared being abandoned again, and he felt his heart contract with a tenderness so sharp it was almost unbearable, a reminder of everything he had lost and everything he had forgotten he was capable of feeling. She opened her eyes slowly, blinking in the pale morning light, and for a moment confusion clouded her features before memory returned, and with it the careful wariness of a child who had learned that safety was always temporary. "Did I really stay the whole night?" she asked, her voice small and wondering, as if she could hardly believe that someone had kept their promise to her, that someone had not sent her back out into the cold when darkness fell and her usefulness ended. Harlan nodded, his throat too tight for words, watching as a smile spread across her face like sunrise breaking over the desert, transforming her features from merely pretty to something approaching radiant. And he understood in that moment why men built churches and wrote poems and went to war for beauty. He rose carefully, his joints protesting the night spent on the hard floor, and began the morning ritual of building up the fire, measuring coffee into the battered pot, slicing more of the stale bread that would have to serve as breakfast until he could get to town for supplies. Josie watched his movements with the intense focus of someone memorizing a dance she might need to perform alone someday, and he found himself moving more deliberately, making each gesture clear and teachable, as if he were passing down the sacred knowledge of survival to a daughter who might need it in the harsh world that waited beyond these walls. "My papa never made coffee," she said, settling herself at the rough table he had built with his own hands 23 years ago, when he had still believed in the possibility of happiness. "Mama said it would stunt my growth, but I always wondered what it tasted like." He poured a small amount into a tin cup, diluting it with milk from the cow he kept in the lean-to behind the cabin, and watched as she took her first tentative sip, her face scrunching up at the bitter taste before smoothing into something approaching appreciation. "It tastes like grown-up things," she declared solemnly, and he found himself smiling for the first time in longer than he could remember. A rusty expression that felt strange on his face, but somehow right, like a key finding its lock after years of searching. They ate in comfortable silence, the kind that exists between people who have shared something profound, who have looked into each other's souls and found not judgment but recognition. And Harlan felt the familiar dread beginning to build in his chest as he realized that this moment, like all moments, would have to end. The sun climbed higher, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and pink that reminded him of Sarah's favorite dress, the one she had worn to church on Sundays when she was still small enough to sit on his lap during the long sermons. Josie finished her breakfast and moved to the window, pressing her nose against the cold glass, her breath fogging the surface as she gazed out at the world that would soon reclaim her. And he could see in the set of her small shoulders that she was preparing herself for another goodbye, another loss in a life that had already contained too many. "The snow's stopping," she said quietly, and he heard in those simple words all the weight of impending separation, all the knowledge that their brief sanctuary was coming to an end, that the real world with its harsh demands and cruel indifference was waiting just beyond the door. He stood behind her, his large hands hovering just above her shoulders, wanting to offer comfort but uncertain of his right to do so, and felt the familiar helplessness that had plagued him since the day he had failed to protect the people who mattered most. "Josie," he said, her name feeling strange and precious on his tongue, like a prayer he had forgotten how to say, and when she turned to look up at him, he saw in her eyes the same desperate hope he felt building in his own chest. The wild possibility that maybe, just maybe, some broken things could be mended after all. The silence stretched between them, like a bridge neither dared to cross, heavy with possibilities that seemed too fragile to speak aloud. And Harlan felt the weight of decision pressing down on him like the sky itself had descended to rest upon his shoulders. Josie stood at the window, her small frame silhouetted against the brightening day, and he could see in the tension of her body that she was preparing to leave, to walk back out into a world that had already proven its capacity for cruelty, to become once again a child alone in the vastness of an indifferent universe. The thought of watching her go, of returning to the hollow echo of his own footsteps in this cabin, filled him with a panic so profound it threatened to buckle his knees, and he realized that somewhere in the space of one night, this small stranger had become essential to his breathing, to his continued existence in a world that had long since lost its meaning. "Where will you go?" he asked, the words scraping against his throat like broken glass, and she turned from the window with a shrug that tried to be casual but couldn't quite hide the fear that lived behind her eyes. "There's a town called Silver Creek about 2 days' walk," she said, her voice carefully steady. "Mama had a sister there, though I don't know if she's still alive. Don't know if she'd want a child she's never met showing up on her doorstep." The casual way she spoke of walking alone through the wilderness, of facing rejection and possible death with the resigned acceptance of someone far too young to understand such things, made something roar to life in Harlan's chest. A protective fury that he had thought died with his own child 20 years ago. He knelt before her, bringing his eyes level with hers, his massive frame folding down until he seemed almost small, almost vulnerable, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of every prayer he had never learned to say. "What if you didn't have to go?" he asked, the words hanging in the air between them like a promise too dangerous to believe. "What if you could stay here with me, and we could figure out how to be a family again?" Josie's eyes widened, hope and disbelief warring across her features like storm clouds racing across the sky. And he could see her trying to protect herself from the possibility of disappointment, trying to build walls around a heart that had already been broken too many times for someone so young. "You mean it?" she whispered, her voice so small he had to lean closer to hear it, and when he nodded, when he reached out to cup her face in his weathered hands, she began to cry with the kind of tears that come from the deepest places of the soul, tears that wash away years of accumulated sorrow and fear and loneliness. "I mean it," he said, his own voice breaking. "I mean it more than I've ever meant anything in my life, little one. And if you'll have me, if you'll let an old broken-down cowboy try to be your papa, then we'll make this work, we'll make it beautiful." She threw herself into his arms with the abandon of someone who has finally found safe harbor after years of drifting in dangerous waters. And he held her against his chest, feeling her small heart beating against his ribs like a bird learning to trust the safety of its cage. The morning light streamed through the windows, painting everything in shades of gold and possibility, and Harlan felt something he had thought was dead forever stirring to life in his chest. A warmth that spread through his body like whiskey on a cold night, like hope returning to a heart that had forgotten how to dream. "We'll need to go to town," he said, his voice muffled against her hair. "Make it legal. Make sure you're safe and protected. Make sure no one can ever take you away from me again." Josie pulled back to look at him, her face shining with a joy so pure it was almost painful to witness, and he saw in her expression the same wonder he felt, the same amazement that two broken souls had somehow found each other in the vastness of an often cruel world. "Can I really call you Papa?" she asked, the word trembling on her lips like a butterfly testing its wings. And when he nodded, when he smiled through his own tears and said, "I'd be honored," she laughed with the kind of delight that makes angels weep with envy. The snow outside continued to melt, revealing the brown earth beneath, and Harlan understood that this was what resurrection looked like. Not the dramatic rising of the dead, but the quiet miracle of two damaged hearts learning to beat in harmony, learning that love could grow in the most unlikely soil, that family was not always about blood, but sometimes about choice, about the decision to open your door to a stranger and discover that they had been the missing piece of your soul all along. Outside, the world waited with all its challenges and uncertainties, but inside the cabin, a giant of a man and a small girl sat together by the fire, planning a future that neither had dared to imagine just 24 hours before, their voices mingling like a prayer of gratitude, rising toward heaven, like the first notes of a song that would play for the rest of their lives.